Hi, this is Ryan Cook from the Moody Bible Institute. This week we're focusing on interpreting poetry and prophecy. For this video, I want to briefly discuss some tips for interpreting poetry, then go on to a discussion of apocalyptic literature. Your reading this week will cover the prophetic genre. Roughly a third of the Bible is poetry. This is a huge chunk of the biblical text. Actually, if you think about the majority of the Bible, it is comprised mainly of story and poetry. Both of those ways of writing appeal not just to our minds, but to our hearts. I think this reflects God's concern for the whole person. Your reading this week will discuss how to interpret poetry. I'd like simply to supplement that by offering two additional tips. First, for interpreting poetry. Hebrew poetry is different than English poetry. In English, we expect certain forms for poetry, like the sonnet or the ballad or some other more familiar form. That is, for those in our culture who read poetry at all. Many of us don't have much first-hand experience with poetry outside of song lyrics or something like that. But it is important to note that Hebrew poetry is based on a different system than any English poetry. It's not based on rhyme or on metrical patterns, but on parallelism. Your reading will go into detail about the different kinds of parallelism in the Hebrew Bible. I'd like to supplement that reading and simplify it by offering a practical method of interpreting parallelism. Hebrew poetry is written in parallelism. That is, the author will say something in the first half of a line, and then in the second half of the line, he will complement it somehow. Your reading will talk about the three main types of parallelism: synonymous, developmental, and contrastive. However, I think a simpler way to think about it is based on the work of Old Testament scholar James Kugel. He would argue that the basic dynamic of parallelism in the Bible is this: A, what's more, B. Let me show you what I mean. Take out your Bibles and look at Psalm chapter 2, verse 4. It says this: "The one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs at them." Let's call the first half of the line A, and the second half of the line B. Most scholars would argue that the first half of this line, "the one enthroned in heaven laughs," is restated in the second half of the line, "the Lord scoffs at them." Thus, this would be an example of synonymous parallelism. However, it's important to note that it is not, strictly speaking, synonymous. Scoffing is not exactly the same thing as laughing. Actually, the second half of the line intensifies the meaning of the first half. A better way of approaching this is to say, A, what's more, B. That is, the one enthroned in heaven laughs, but not only that, the Lord actually scoffs at them. The second half of the line sharpens or deepens the meaning of the first half of the line. Let's look at another example from Psalm 121, verse 3. It says this: "He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber." Now, many scholars would see this as an example of developmental parallelism. That is, the author states something in the first half of the line and then goes beyond it in the second half of the line. You could also analyze this from the A, what's more, B approach. To paraphrase, "He will not let your foot slip." Not only that, the one who watches over you never even slumbers. He's never not watching you. Again, the second half of the line sharpens the first half of the line. There's an emphatic quality to the second half of the line simply in the fact that it comes last. So that's my first tip for studying Hebrew poetry. With parallelism, for each line, ask A, what's more, B? Or how does the second half of the line sharpen or go beyond the first half of the line? My second tip for studying Hebrew poetry is this: don't lose sight of the big picture. It's easy to get distracted and caught up in each line, but force yourself to go beyond that and look at the poem as a whole. What is the message of the whole poem? What was the author trying to do with the poem? If you're in the Psalms, it means looking at the entire psalm to get a sense for what the main message is first, and then that will help you analyze each of the poetic lines. So don't lose your focus on the big picture. Now, the other issue I wanted to address today is a particular type of prophetic speech called apocalyptic literature. The Bible has a few sections of apocalyptic literature, namely some sections in the book of Daniel and Zechariah, and primarily the book of Revelation in the New Testament. When you begin to read apocalyptic, you immediately sense that you're entering into a different world, a world full of rich imagery and symbolism. Now, this is not the place for a full-scale look at apocalyptic, but I did want to introduce you to some of the interpretive issues. If you want to take this further, I'd invite you to read a section on apocalyptic in your textbook. The first point I'd like to make is about the context of apocalyptic literature. It is crisis literature. That is, it is written out of the context of a crisis. Consider the book of Daniel. He wrote in the context of the Babylonian exile. Or John wrote Revelation while he was in exile on Patmos. It was a context of being persecuted because of his faith. So the authors of apocalyptic were writing from the position of a persecuted minority, and that certainly impacts their message. Second, it is important to point out that apocalyptic literature seems bizarre to us upon first reading. The reason for that is we really have no equivalent to it in our culture. However, it was a fairly common genre in the biblical world, especially around the time the book of Revelation was written. The original readers would have been more familiar with the imagery that John used than we are today. So it's up to us to recapture that and to try to enter into that world. Now, as you approach the apocalyptic books of the Bible, I have 5 tips to give you in interpreting this type of writing. The first tip is this: study apocalyptic in light of how the genre was understood in the ancient world. Recognize that it was a familiar type of speech for the original reader, and interpret the book in light of how they would have understood it. Secondly, think hard about and research who the original author and who the original audience was. This will help you put up some boundaries as to what the text can and can't mean. Whatever apocalyptic literature means, it must have meant something to the original readers. God had a message for them. Thus, some interpretations you hear of the book of Revelation, where sometimes you hear things like the locusts stand for helicopters or something like that, you know that can't be quite right. They certainly would not have understood it that way. The original readers wouldn't. Third tip: don't attempt to press every detail of the text. Revelation and apocalyptic literature in general has a lot of metaphorical language. Look for the main point and don't get too distracted by the details. Fourthly, seek to understand the main point of the text. Despite how difficult and obscure apocalyptic might seem to be on the surface, the main message of these books are fairly clear. They focus on things like God's sovereignty, on the fact that despite how things look, in the end, God wins, and similar types of themes. So make those the main focus of your interpretation as well. And then finally, appreciate and enter into the rich imagery of the text. This is a type of writing that's intended to engage your imagination. There's much more that could be said and should be said about this type of writing. Again, to take this further, I'd start with the chapter on apocalyptic in your textbook. And resources are also really helpful in getting at the cultural context of apocalyptic. Things like the Bible background commentary and things like that. So have a good week studying the Word, and I look forward to interacting with you.